Now I would like to introduce Mr. Thomas Brilt, who is not only the energy leader in ARUP, A-R-U-P, ARUP group, but also the chairman of Hydrogen Committee of IPPF, Independent Power Producers Forum. And I have been listening to his speeches several times to admire him for his abundant knowledge and incisive analysis and comments in hydrogen. Thomas will also answer questions after his speech, as he has to deliver another talk in Singapore from 4:45, right, to 5:30. So we have a saying in Chinese, 能者多劳 and I make the translation in English, is capacity invites laboriousness. So I present to you Mr. Thomas Briot. I'm not sure my pronunciation is correct. Thomas, it's your floor.
Thanks, Dominic. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak to you today, and thanks to Dominic and to the organising committee. My presentation will essentially be broken into two parts. The first half covering some recent research that Arup undertook with the Global Infrastructure Investor Association, and the second covering a project I recently worked on in the UK, which hopefully will help highlight some of the fiscal and regulatory interventions that we've seen to be needed to create a hydrogen economy. So the Global Infrastructure Investor Association research we undertook gathered opinions from investors around the world on the current and future state of hydrogen investments. You can download the report using the link on the screen, which will be available in the presentation pack that you can get hold of after the event. Just some brief background on Arup and the GIIA. So Arup provides engineering, design and strategy advice across a wide range of built environment topics, including low carbon energy solutions such as hydrogen. And the GIIA represents infrastructure investors globally in working with policymakers, regulators and industry bodies to enable infrastructure investment around the world. So on to the report itself. First, to set the scene, we all know about the climate imperative, and it's clear and unequivocal. As the IPCC stated in its most recent report, immediate, rapid and large-scale cuts in greenhouse emissions are needed to keep within the minimum target of maximum target of 2 degrees warming. And the World Energy Council, as shown in this graph, have actually looked more specifically on what that means for hydrogen infrastructure and state that somewhere between 6,000 and 25,000 terawatt hours of clean hydrogen is needed to achieve this goal. Today, the world produces somewhere like 3,000 terawatt hours, and mostly, I mean, 99% of that is dirty, i.e. it's grey, brown or black hydrogen, as in fact Hazel highlighted. And my own suspicions, having worked on this for some time, is in fact the need for hydrogen is probably at the upper bound for this, or perhaps even greater than that, given that the number of countries that have announced a zero carbon target is currently at 75, but who knows, after COP26, I'm sure we'll see a few more. And many of them have announced that target, and we'll see what comes from that in terms of NDC commitments. One thing that we asked investors through our survey was how much of a role did they think that hydrogen would play in the global energy system, both in 2030, the purple bars on this graph, and in 2050, the red bars. As you can see, investors believe that it'll play an increasing role as we move towards 2050, with about a quarter believing it will play a major role similar to the role that oil and gas currently play today. So that's the top bar. The image on the left is a separate piece of assessment that Arup have undertaken on the need for hydrogen in Singapore to decarbonize the energy system. So the y-axis shows the emissions and the x-axis shows time out to 2050. And in order to meet their current nationally determined contributions, the NDCs in the dark red line, that falls from 2030. Let alone achieve zero carbon, hydrogen is needed for that. So the unabated emissions are shown rising over time, and by 2050 they nearly double. So to reach the 2050 target, the various different wedges of carbon reduction, ones related to hydrogen are shown in green, are needed. And what's clear here is that Singapore, and I believe probably many of the Asian countries, would find it very difficult to get to zero carbon without the use of hydrogen. The survey of GII members found that although only 16% of investors have currently concluded or are in the process of being engaged in hydrogen-related infrastructure, almost 70% believe that hydrogen will be an important part for some applications by 2030, and 90% believe that hydrogen will play some role in the energy system in 2050. And this demonstrates a disparity between the current investment activity and the potential for future growth. And policy and regulatory intervention is urgently needed to catalyze private sector investment in the coming months and years if hydrogen is going to play its necessary part in the decarbonisation of the economy. I'll talk about some of the policy and regulatory and fiscal incentives needed in the second half of my talk. But what these statistics highlight is that firstly, we have not valued carbon reduction enough to have built a hydrogen economy. And the second part is that highlights that investors believe that in the future, hydrogen will drive carbon reduction, even if it requires some short-term incentives to getting a hydrogen economy up and running. So we asked investors what part of the value chain they were likely to invest in and at what scale. And what we can see here from the production and transportation looks to be the biggest investment opportunities for GII members. And I guess the slightly lower end user opportunities are part of the issue. Where is that secure revenue? Who's actually going to use that hydrogen? Who is incentivized sufficiently to pay for the hydrogen we can produce? What's clear is that the total investment need is huge. 300 billion, going back to those World Energy Council estimates of what is needed to keep us under the 1.5 degrees warming. So 300 billion by 2030, 1.5 trillion US dollars by 2050. And to achieve that, we need more than just announcements and plans, a few trial projects. The industry needs government and policymakers to create a clear mechanism for revenue so that they can make a return on those investments. Interestingly, investors responded to our who responded to our survey seem to think that the biggest opportunities are in Western Europe, North America, and Australia, but I suspect that's possibly a function of who responded. So as we heard, actually, there are huge opportunities in China from Hazel, and I believe there's some huge opportunities across Asia, South Korea being the first to create a hydrogen law. Japan, Singapore all need hydrogen in order to decarbonize their economies. And I think many other Asian countries, as they try and transition away from coal, will increasingly need to see the use of hydrogen. What was also interesting from the survey is that investors believe the biggest barrier to hydrogen investment is economic competitiveness. But actually, I would argue that that comes down to government policy and regulation. It's only economically viable to collect waste, rubbish from the general population, because governments value or create a policy that values waste collection sufficiently to collect taxes and then pay companies to collect refuse, right? So the same really should apply to CO2 waste. And the reason hydrogen has not been economically viable in the past is because we haven't valued carbon reduction sufficiently. But that seems to be changing. The carbon board mechanism in Europe is driving an increase in carbon price, and we heard a little bit about a carbon price in China from Hazel again. All of these things will help drive a hydrogen economy. And if individual governments want to have some of their waste CO2 collected or never even emitted, they'll need to create the economic competitiveness in hydrogen through a variety of mechanisms. So actually now I'll go on and talk about a real life project example to highlight some of those interventions that we could make. So first, a little bit of background. Arup were appointed by UK gas transmission and distribution companies to undertake a feasibility study to examine the potential for hydrogen production, importation, storage, and subsequent distribution to London and the southeast of England. The idea was to create a hub at the Isle of Grain, which is the UK's largest LNG import terminal. And the study assessed a number of technologies for the potential and potential customers for becoming a catalyst to a hydrogen economy, helping to decarbonize significant parts of the UK. So the partners have grown over the project. The project is now going into FEED studies. Arup are actually an investor in this project, along with these partners that you see here. And in terms of the Isle of Grain, there are some specific characteristics that make it a good site. It's got excellent connectivity. It's got extensive LNG storage and great links to gas and transmission pipelines. And there's some adjacent wind farms. As it turns out, they are not close enough to make landing a cable for the production of green hydrogen cost competitive. But there are also 3 adjacent power stations, CCGT power stations, and nearby aviation storage and distribution facilities. There's also an existing pier currently not in use, which could be converted for the import of hydrogen or potentially the export of CO2 if we go with blue hydrogen, which seems to be the option, and plenty of available industrial land. So in terms of new dedicated pipeline for hydrogen, we assessed the possibility of going along the existing pipe routes from the Isle of Grain, and then the further potential of a connection all the way into London to help decarbonize transport for London, a specific very large end user in the centre. So having concluded that direct connections to offshore wind were not viable, it soon became clear that reformation technology was much better for this particular site, and the price of electricity, with the price of electricity at industrial prices rather than green electricity, the levelized cost for hydrogen from electrolysis was actually 3 times that than from reformation technology, so including carbon capture and storage. And the scale of the production ambition in phase 1 alone is a 180 megawatt plant producing 110 tons of hydrogen daily. And it also, at that scale, reformation was really in the short term, the only viable solution. So cost calculations included the refurbishment of a jetty, the installation of CO2 temporary storage, the offload vessel for long-term carbon sequestration, and then carbon sequestration at the Northern Lights at the Northern Lights project in Norway. So we were going to send CO2 to be sequestered off-site. Achieving this vision for hydrogen reduction hub in London and the southeast of England for ultra-low carbon is a very ambitious task, and we looked at a huge program of building up the different phases so that we get to 7.5 gigawatts of hydrogen production by the time we get out towards 2040. Given these cost differences between what it costs normally to produce to use CO2, to use natural gas versus hydrogen, the UK has looked at different parts of the hydrogen economy and how it could be supported. So some of those mechanisms that start to create a hydrogen economy. So with regards to this project, Project Cavendish, we discovered that the additional cost of hydrogen production is somewhere between 2 to 3 UK pence per kilowatt hour. So I guess that's 3 to 4 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour, depending on the mechanism chosen for funding. But in terms of pounds per ton of carbon saved or dollars per ton of carbon saved, that was less than the UK spent on offshore wind incentives 15 to 20 years ago. And on Project Cavendish, we considered funding options to make up that difference, essentially the doubling in the price of wholesale gas, through a variety of different mechanisms. So these 5 different mechanisms. So firstly, we looked at hydrogen production facility, and regulatory security, probably provided by a kind of long-term feed-in tariff or contract for difference for hydrogen, could result in a fully privately funded project. Public ownership of the plant might be strange for the UK, since public ownership of generation assets is no longer a model used in the UK, but a regulated asset model might be a compromise between the two, essentially where it's owned by the private sector for a concession period and then re-tendered out again. So that's for the production facility itself and how that could be funded. In terms of hydrogen production, because of the ongoing cost of fuel, in this case natural gas, and the cost then of carbon sequestration, some form of ongoing revenue support is needed. And I suspect the most likely would be a contract for difference model, as an auction system for the price of hydrogen, since that's considered to be working well in the UK for forms of electricity in particular, but ultimately a carbon price might do the same job. And the carbon border mechanism in Europe may work for that incentive. Of course, that's currently outside of the UK is outside of Europe now. So other countries, a feed-in tariff may provide more certainty depending on their particular market model. What's clear is it needs revenue support. In terms of carbon sequestration, that's an interesting one. Our techno-economic modeling assumed that a price we would pay for sequestration is somewhere between $50 and $60 per ton of CO2 that needs to be long-term sequestered. And that seems to be the price that the Northern Lights project would charge. But we didn't look at in detail on this project at sequestration itself. Ultimately, the cost is part of the cost of hydrogen production. So again, it could be incorporated into a contract for difference or a feed-in tariff, so that the cost of long-term sequestration can be incorporated into the production of blue hydrogen. In terms of hydrogen distribution pipelines. I think a regulated asset-based model used for the gas networks already in the UK is probably likely to be the most viable solution. And in fact, all of the partners included, all the transmission and distribution partners included within their regulated asset base proposals to the government, because they operate the pipelines currently carrying natural gas, a sort of reopener to convert those natural gas pipelines where needed to be able to carry hydrogen. As you know, there are some differences. Some pipelines would need to be upgraded in order to be able to carry the very small molecule of hydrogen versus natural gas. And it's a very similar story for the transmission pipelines. In the UK, we competitively appoint a transmission owner through what's called a CATO model. A national grid also included a reopener in its recent bid to the energy regulator in the UK in order to be able to upgrade its pipelines and include the costs for hydrogen conversion. So some of the key conclusions for Project Cavendish: only reformation can meet the scale and price requirements in the UK. And I think that's still currently the case in most places. Green hydrogen is still more expensive than blue, though we're seeing that fall. And as it begins to fall, there'll be a point at which the price of blue hydrogen becomes more expensive than green hydrogen. Low carbon advanced gas reformation can achieve 97% carbon capture, but we must be very clear about this. And there was some recent publication by a number of professors looking at whether blue hydrogen was actually more damaging, and they showed some graphs that showed blue hydrogen being more damaging than direct coal fired power stations. The thing was, they took the worst case of the worst case. So they assumed fracked gas was used in the production of hydrogen and the fugitive emissions associated with North American fracked gas. They also assumed SMR, old SMR technology, which allows essentially about only captures about 60% of the CO2 from the reformation process, meaning 40% escapes. And in fact, we have technology now that can be 97% carbon capture. So when creating blue hydrogen, we have to make sure that it's green blue hydrogen, if you see what I mean. There is sufficient energy efficiency. There is significant energy efficiency gains to have co-location of LNG and blue hydrogen production. And in fact, in order to create green hydrogen, you split water, as you know, and that creates quite a lot of oxygen. Well, you can use that oxygen in highly efficient reformation technology to create blue hydrogen. So the co-location of blue and green hydrogen has some significant potential for the future. Initially, we're focusing on power generation and Project Cavendish. So there were nearby assets with significant carbon reduction potential, and that would really kickstart the project before rolling out into blending in natural gas in distribution pipework. And the cost of CO2 reduction using hydrogen is less than that of offshore wind. So yes, hydrogen is more expensive. We created a feed-in tariff for offshore wind. We've created a feed-in tariff for solar. Look what's happened to those prices. Hydrogen just needs the same kick to move forward. And then finally, some form of revenue support in the form of that feed-in tariff or contract for difference is needed for the large-scale uptake of hydrogen. So just back to finally the catalyzing hydrogen investment report that we produced with GIIA. Key conclusions for that were that if we want to see a economy developed. Governments, policymakers need to publish a clear time-bound plan. They need to focus on applications with low risks for future regret. And they need to continue to fund research and development. And at some point, they'll have to choose production pathways and importation pathways. And they should focus on those based on their merits. But at the moment, you know, those clear time-bound plans are essential. They need to develop policy mechanisms to incentivize and mandate hydrogen, right? You know, we mandated the collection of waste. We used our general taxation to collect that waste, that refuse. Now it's time to do it for our CO2 waste. And we have to open the way for hydrogen blending in our gas networks. And that means sometimes changing the regulations associated with our gas networks. It might mean paying for the upgrade of those gas networks, but only by providing some sort of price certainty can we get those investors we surveyed to really make those big investments. So fiscal incentives and early revenue support are going to be needed. In terms of green hydrogen, and I'll finish on this slide, the process of going through to a kind of coordinated circular economy for hydrogen is going to require you know, cost and efficiency of electrolyzers to improve, and we're starting to see that, but only by creating some sort of demand, some revenue support for hydrogen production, are we going to see that investment in electrolyzers. The cost of electricity and green electricity will need to come down, but in the interim, I think we can leverage the vast knowledge of the oil and gas industry in helping produce blue hydrogen and using CO2 even potentially to stimulate you know, gas extraction for those wells that we still need to tap in order to produce zero or very low carbon hydrogen. Again, you know, we need to see that investment in hydrogen, and that's going to take some innovative business models. But again, that comes down to this yellow box around market regulation and structure that will help do that. And then finally, if we're talking green hydrogen, we've got to think about electrolyzer use. We've got to think about defining what is green hydrogen. If you're using electrolyzers to produce hydrogen just from solar, they're only going to be operating for 6 hours out of 18 on average, which means the size of those electrolyzers and the capital cost of them is going to be very, very large. The alternative would be to size them much smaller, generate excess renewable energy during the day and export that onto the grid, and then import from the grid during the night, and therefore run your electrolyzers for longer. So that's everything I had to present today. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I'm now open for any questions you might have.
I have made some questions, but you are going to deliver a speech elsewhere in Singapore. So I have already typed down all the questions. You try to answer them if you have time. But before I do that, Mr. Colin Tam has a question. So let him talk to you first. You ask your question first.
Thank you, Chairman. Thomas, you mentioned that it might be okay for public policy to build a system to collect the CO2 just the same way as we spend public money to collect the garbage. When we collect the MSW, we can send it to the landfill. Where is the CO2 going to go if the government will pay for a system to collect them?
A very interesting question. I think in the case of the Project Cavendish that we had, there's a Northern Lights project, which is a joint venture between the Norwegian government, Shell, and Equinor. And in fact, what needed to happen there in Europe in order to get over World Trade Organization rules on the export of waste was a slight change in the way that CO2 is treated. But there are lots and lots of gas wells around the world that if we value the collection of CO2 sufficiently, I'm sure we can get the oil and gas majors to work very closely to convert their gas wells, which we have sucked natural gas out of. We can get them to convert them into places to insert the CO2. The issue at the moment is we haven't valued that waste collection sufficiently to make that commercially viable. But as I said, the same applies with waste. At a certain point, you pay people enough money to drive garbage trucks around every street in every city, and in fact, all the way out into the countryside in most countries to collect waste. So it's just a question of how much we pay those oil and gas majors to collect our waste.
By the way, it depends, Thomas, depends on your time. I have written down 4 questions for you. You try your best to answer one by one. If you don't have enough time, then you stop there. Maybe answer 1 or 2 questions. So here on the screen is my first question. I read it to you. It was interesting to see what investors need to get projects off the ground, namely a secure revenue stream. Which countries do you think will be the first to provide that secure revenue stream that enables investors to build a hydrogen economy at scale?
A very interesting question, and I think it depends on many things. Korea are the first to have put into law a requirement around hydrogen. I can see in other Asian countries doing something similar soon. Japan import a huge amount of their energy needs, as do Singapore, in the form of LNG. And therefore, I would imagine one of these economies might be early. Another economy might be Germany. They import a huge amount of gas and now coal because of their move away from nuclear. And so I can see some European nations also being early adopters of a feed-in requirement, a feed-in tariff, or a requirement for carbon reduction. I think big exporters of hydrogen, such as Australia or other generators, may also drive a requirement for hydrogen at some point in the future, just to stimulate their own economies and drive the cost of their hydrogen production down.
Okay, my second question is, what will be your one request to the legislators to build a hydrogen economy?
I think it's mandate the use of hydrogen in electricity production, even if it is a very small amount, 1 or 2% in the gas grids. I mean, Singapore has a town's gas network, which is 50% hydrogen, and they use a reformation, it's grey hydrogen, so they emit the CO2 to run its town's gas network. So it's perfectly possible to inject 1 or 2% into natural gas networks without really disrupting energy generation or gas use in the short term, and that would stimulate a market for hydrogen, various different bits of infrastructure that are needed, and would start to bring down the price. And then you could you could have mechanisms similar to mechanisms which have been used in Korea, in UK, in lots of different countries, where you require each year a slight increase in the amount of hydrogen in the gas networks. And that was done for renewable energy in the UK, in Korea. So I would say require hydrogen use.
Good. My next question is, do you think big oil and gas companies and business have a role in a future hydrogen economy?
Certainly, I think oil and gas companies do. At the moment, they're really looking around for what their role is in the energy transition. Some of them are moving into renewable energy, but in fact, often they're not the most nimble at doing that. And the development of renewable energy actually requires kind of fast-paced, on-the-ground development of projects. So, but I think blue hydrogen allows a mechanism for downstream gas use to convert, midstream transportation, storage, and conversion, which is core business of the oil and gas companies, and in fact the upstream businesses, in the extraction of natural gas to be converted into blue hydrogen, and B, also for the injection of CO2 into their gas wells. At the moment, gas wells, many gas wells, are starting to look a little bit like a bit of a stranded asset. How are you going to close those gas wells down economically if everyone just stops using gas? But in fact, if they become valuable assets for the injection of CO2, the oil and gas industry actually has a huge role to play. And given that still, 90% of our energy is hydrogen, is hydrocarbon based, there's a big opportunity for oil and gas.
Very good, Thomas. My last question is, do you think carbon capture and storage will play a significant role, or will a hydrogen economy only emerge with green hydrogen?
It's an interesting question. I think, as I said, I think oil and gas industry have a big role to play, and that's predominantly going to be blue hydrogen. I mean, okay, they can play a role in the downstream and midstream elements for the transportation of green hydrogen, but actually a lot of their major impact is in the upstream potential. And currently there are only some places in the world where the cost of hydrogen is sufficiently low in order to be able for green hydrogen to be cheaper than blue. So Australia, maybe some parts of the Sahara, maybe some parts of the US, but generally green hydrogen is still more expensive because of the inefficiencies of the conversion into hydrogen, and then more specifically the transportation of green hydrogen, because hydrogen is quite hard to, other than through a pipeline. Once you have to put it on a ship, unlike LNG, the energy penalty is not 10%, it's 50%. So transportation globally of green hydrogen has a big energy penalty associated with it. So even if you can produce it really cheaply in the US or in Australia, it becomes much more expensive to then convert that into a shippable fuel and send it to Japan, Korea, Singapore that have to import. So I think in the medium term, blue hydrogen will play a very significant role, yes.
Thank you, Thomas. I finished my questions, but if you look at the screen, there are questions from the floor. It depends on your time, because you have to rush to speak to another conference. So pick up some questions on the screen and answer them when you have enough time.
You may not be able to see it.
You may not be able to see it?
Yeah, those check just for the Joshua to know.
Okay, if you cannot see it, I read it to you. Is there any problem in transporting hydrogen in existing pipeline in Europe?
Yeah, good question. Some of the gas networks in Europe are capable of taking hydrogen as they are. certainly new plastic pipelines, polyethylene pipelines would be needed. So old steel pipelines have some issues associated with hydrogen leakage. It's a very small element and can get out through joints, etc. And so you need plastic pipework. The other issue, well, there are a number of other issues. The volumetric energy density of hydrogen is about a third of natural gas. So the volume of gas that you have to transmit is 3 times what you need or the volume of hydrogen you need to transmit is 3 times that of natural gas. And so that creates an issue in terms of capacity of pipelines. I think there's also a potential issue associated with conversion of various different bits of infrastructure. So some older some older infrastructure that's going to be end users, whether that's CCGT plant or industrial users, will find it harder to convert to hydrogen, and we can't just do it all in one go. The issue with hydrogen is that the flame speed associated with it is much faster than natural gas. So if you use it in the same burners as natural gas, the flame would go straight down the pipeline. You'd get a big explosion. So you need to check. You need to convert all of the end use burners for hydrogen. And that conversion was done in the UK, in fact, in the other direction when we went from Towns gas to natural gas. We now have to go back again. And in doing that switch, you may need parallel pipelines for some period of time, to some extent. A long and complicated answer to your question, but there are many European networks that can take it, but I think there's also a lot of upgrade and change that will be needed at the same time.
Thank you so much, Thomas. The others are not questioned. They only say, Thomas, great presentation, and thank you, etc. Okay.
Thank you,
Go
everyone.
ahead with your other speech, and we all thank you very much for your presentation. Give you a big hand.
Thank you very much.
Certainly, I will see you again. I listen to your other speeches again in the near future. Bye-bye.